Just because she was a black girl sitting in the wrong seat in a courtroom, Naomi Hayes, 12 years old, was grabbed by the shoulder and yanked to her feet by Lieutenant Kellerman, while dozens of adults around her just sat in silence. They grabbed her by the collar, and her notebook fell to the floor like discarded evidence from a child no one deemed worthy. Kellerman said coldly, "In here, I am the law." But the officer, drunk on power, had no idea that little Naomi was the daughter of the United States Attorney General, and that one pull didn't just topple a child, it dragged a rotten system down into the abyss. Where do you live? Does justice in your country come in colors? The courtroom was hushed, wrapped in the solemnity that clung to its walls like dust that no cleaning ever reached. Naomi Hayes, 12 years old and dressed in her neatly pressed navy blue school uniform, sat on the third bench from the front, an area unofficially reserved for guardians and legal representatives. Her feet dangled above the polished linoleum floor, not yet long enough to touch. Her back was straight, rigid, not from discomfort but from principle. A slim, spiral-bound notebook rested open on her lap. Shafts of sunlight pierced the tall windows above and fell in fractured patches across the pages, casting jagged lines like cracked glass over her steady, deliberate handwriting. She was still, too still. From the left aisle, the rhythmic thud of leather heels cut through the silence. Lieutenant Martha Kellerman appeared in full uniform, her belt stiff with regulation, her holster sealed, her brow tight with command. She wasn't used to anomalies in this space. She was the kind of officer whose power thrived on routine, structure, unspoken lines that others obeyed without ever daring to see them. And now, in her courtroom, a term she used privately, possessively, there was a girl, alone, sitting too straight, in the wrong place. Kellerman slowed. Her eyes flicked downward with the efficiency of a scanner. The name tag on the child's chest read Hayes. Her lips pursed. The badge beside the name was issued for court clearance, not observation. She stared at it too long, not because she didn't understand it, but because it didn't make sense to her worldview. Children waited in the lobby. Children fidgeted. Children got shushed. This one had the gall to sit here, unmoving, as if entitled to presence. "You lost, sweetheart?" Kellerman asked. Voice flat, void of compassion, a glass surface with ice underneath. Naomi looked up. There was nothing impolite in the way she did it, no challenge, no defiance, but something in her gaze didn't drop. Not to the floor, not to Kellerman's belt, not to the badge on her chest. It just held, calm and unreadable. "I'm waiting for my father," she said. 7 words, spoken as a statement, not an excuse, not a plea, not an apology. And yet, Kellerman felt them like a small crack in a pane of glass that might spread if tapped again. Waiting for her father. In this courtroom, on that bench, with that name, the silence that followed was unnerving in its weight. There was no sound, not even the usual shuffling of papers from the clerk's desk. Naomi's words, though quiet, still hung in the air. The rays of light from above had shifted slightly, now cutting sharper lines across the girl's notebook. A soft glint caught on the curve of her pen. Kellerman's eyes narrowed. Her glance dropped to the notebook, then back to the girl's face. It was the look of someone searching for insubordination where none had been declared. "Yeah, what's your father's name?" she asked, her voice slightly sharper this time. The softness evaporated. Naomi's hand moved, not toward Kellerman but toward the notebook. She didn't speak. She lifted a folded piece of paper from between the pages and extended it. Her fingers were small, her wrist steady. Kellerman didn't take the paper. She looked at it, then at the girl, then, with a flick of her hand, brushed it aside. The paper fluttered to the bench, folded edge still neat. Naomi didn't flinch. "Where's your guardian?" Kellerman pressed, stepping in now, looming. "I told you," Naomi said. Her voice didn't rise. It wasn't stubborn, it was simply consistent, the way facts are. I'm waiting for my father." There was a small intake of breath from someone across the room. Maybe a clerk. Maybe one of the assistants is pretending not to pay attention. But no one spoke. No one dared interrupt whatever this was becoming. Kellerman stood over the girl now. She didn't like this. The silence, the optics, the unwavering tone. It challenged her authority most insidiously, without ever actually disobeying her. She glanced sideways at a junior officer across the room, who instinctively took half a step forward. Kellerman shot him a look that said, "Don't." The officer froze. Naomi looked down for the first time, not at her lap, but at the floor just beside her shoe. Her foot didn't reach it. There was a half-inch of air between her sole and the tile. That half-inch, in this moment, held more gravity than all the badges in the room. "You can't sit here," Kellerman said, and this time her voice wasn't just official. It was final. "This is for adults involved in proceedings, not children with stories." Naomi turned her head slightly, not fast, not abrupt, just enough to reestablish the line of sight between them. She didn't blink. "I'm involved," she said. It was then Kellerman's eye caught the first word written in ink on the notebook page beside Naomi, just barely visible under the shifting light. "Tuesday." Then a line beneath it, then bullet points. "An organized mind, an observant child." "Who told you to come in here?" Kellerman asked. She was standing too close now, not touching, but past the line of reasonable distance. Naomi didn't answer. She reached again for the notebook. The movement was so quiet, it should have gone unnoticed, but it didn't. She gently pulled it closer to her chest. Kellerman saw red, not rage, not heat, but threat. Her arm snapped forward, fingers catching Naomi's shoulder, firm and uninvited. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't violent, but it was the kind of contact designed to provoke compliance, a signal that said, "Move, now." Naomi remained seated. Her back didn't slacken. Her hand still held the notebook. Her shoulder didn't recoil. Kellerman didn't know what to make of this stillness. She leaned in. "You don't belong here," she said quietly, slowly, emphasizing every syllable like it was a warning etched in stone. Naomi, in that same steady tone, responded, "I didn't come to belong. I came to wait." A breath caught somewhere in the room. Kellerman's fingers tightened slightly on the child's arm, and Naomi's other hand released the notebook. It slid from her lap, fell edge first, and landed with a loud slap on the floor. The sound was sharper than it should have been. It rang out and died in the corners of the room, like the kind of echo people tried to pretend they didn't hear. All eyes turned, but still, no one spoke. Kellerman's eyes dropped to the floor. The notebook lay open, its pages exposed. On the visible page, written in block letters with a blue ballpoint pen, were the words, "Law doesn't whisper." There was something obscene about seeing those words in a child's handwriting, something too pointed, too clear. Kellerman stared at the letters for a beat too long. "You need to go downstairs," she said, voice now clipped, almost hoarse. Naomi didn't move. "I'm waiting," she said once more. "For my father." Kellerman bent down, swift, her movements no longer wrapped in protocol. She scooped up the notebook, flipped it shut without asking, and held it in one hand like evidence. Her other hand gestured toward the rear hallway. But in that moment, no one moved. Not Naomi, not Kellerman, not the room. Something had broken. Not loud, not visible, but real. And everyone in that courtroom, whether they admitted it or not, felt it. The girl had not screamed. She hadn't fought. She hadn't claimed injustice. But she had sat, and she had waited, and she had written, "Law doesn't whisper." The rest would come later. The names, the consequences, the video, the fury. But in that moment, all that existed was a girl on a bench, a badge too proud to bend, and a silence that weighed more than any gavel. The silence hadn't yet settled from the fall of the notebook when Kellerman moved. Not with words, not with protocol, but with the crude decisiveness of someone whose grip on control had been scratched. She stepped forward again, her boots landing hard against the tile, each footfall a denial of the restraint her badge was meant to represent. Without a word, without any warning, she reached down and seized Naomi's shoulder, tight, commanding fingers pressing deep into the fabric of the girl's blazer as though gripping something disobedient, something wrong. She yanked upward, dragging Naomi to her feet in one abrupt motion that was meant to assert more than force. It was a lesson. "This is an adult area," Kellerman hissed, her voice no longer coated in the detached chill of authority, but cracked open into something bitter. "You belong downstairs." Naomi didn't resist, not physically, not by flinching, not by pulling away. Her posture adjusted to standing as naturally as if she'd chosen it, though it hadn't been her choice. Her face stayed even, eyes still on Kellerman, measured, unblinking. It wasn't defiance, it was precision, and Kellerman hated it. Instead of stepping back or speaking, Naomi let her hand drift slowly downward, fingers parting from the side of her jacket to reach for the notebook Kellerman had picked up only minutes before. She didn't take it, she simply touched it, and with the lightest tug, let it fall. It slipped from the lieutenant's hand and tumbled to the ground again, this time more deliberately, more slowly, its spiral binding twisting mid-air before it landed flat on its back. Open. The page was the same blue ink, the same brutal truth, was printed in block letters with the quiet conviction of someone who didn't need volume to be heard. Law doesn't whisper. Kellerman's face froze, her mouth slightly open, not in shock, but in the first breath before a curse. She bent quickly, snatched the notebook back up, and flipped it shut with a slap that echoed louder than the fall. Her eyes flared, her jaw clenched, and for a split second, something in her expression cracked open, a thin, jagged line that exposed the thing inside that hated being challenged by silence more than it ever hated being shouted at. She turned toward the nearest officer, a young man in training with a clean badge and eyes not yet dulled by routine. He took an instinctive step forward, drawn by the awkwardness of the interaction, the forcefulness of the gesture, and the thin frame of the girl, now standing stiffly beneath Kellerman's hand. "Lieutenant," he started, uncertain. Her head whipped in his direction. Her stare was sharp, clinical, and lethal. It sliced across the air like a thrown knife. She didn't speak, didn't even need to lift a hand. The look was enough. He stopped mid-step, words dying somewhere between his throat and his pride. He stepped back. Kellerman returned her attention to Naomi. "You don't get to decide where you sit," she spat, her voice curling with disgust, each syllable sharpened with something that reeked of bitterness wrapped in procedure. "You don't get to speak to me like you matter. You don't get to look at me like you belong here." Naomi's eyes didn't move. They stayed locked, unblinking, unbending. "I'm waiting for my father," she said again. But this time, she added, "He's on his way." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't name-dropping. It was a statement, a fixed point in a room where everything else felt like it was shifting, grinding, collapsing into some slow-motion catastrophe. Kellerman's face changed. Not fully, not in any way that could be described, but something behind the eyes twitched. Recognition, maybe? Or suspicion? A calculation starting too late? She opened her mouth to reply, to ask something, to reassert the hierarchy she thought had been permanent. But Naomi wasn't done. "I'm not interfering with the process," she said. "I'm not making a scene. I'm just waiting where he told me he'd find me." There was nothing in the girl's tone that suggested escalation, but Kellerman felt it anyway. That sour taste of being undermined without being overthrown. The notebook was still in her hand, her fingers tightened around it. "Your father doesn't matter here," Kellerman said, her voice flattening into that dangerous, razor-thin line between insult and verdict. "Whoever he is, whatever you think he is, it doesn't matter." She leaned down again, bringing her face closer to Naomi's, the smell of processed starch and synthetic leather clinging to her uniform like residue from too many roles played for too long. "In this room," she said, voice a quiet, venom-laced whisper, "I am the law." There was no response, Naomi didn't blink. Her gaze didn't flinch. The quiet between them was so dense it felt like smoke. The hallway beyond the courtroom door had gone silent. The assistant clerks had stopped pretending to shuffle paperwork. Even the clicking from the stenographer's keyboard had ceased, as if unsure what language could capture this. The young officer who had stepped forward earlier was now standing frozen by the side wall. His fingers twitched near his belt, where his radio waited. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the force of the atmosphere had drained every available courage from the room. Kellerman hadn't shouted. She didn't need to. The brutality was not in its volume, but in its clarity. "I don't care who your father is," she said again, louder this time, the venom no longer hidden. "In here, I don't ask. I tell. I am the law." It was that last sentence that cracked the silence. Not physically, but emotionally. Like glass hit with a single hammer tap, the fracture was instant. Kellerman's assertion didn't just land. It detonated. It didn't echo. It reverberated through the bodies of everyone present. A sentence that didn't demand understanding but forced submission. Naomi breathed in once, so shallow it barely moved her shoulders. Then she bent, slow and graceful, and picked up her notebook from the floor, wiping off the corner with her sleeve before cradling it against her chest. Her face was unreadable, still calm, still young, still very, very present. No one else spoke. No one else moved. The courtroom was wrapped again in silence. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the passive kind, not the orderly kind. This was the silence of withheld outrage, of people recording everything not on paper, but in memory. Because now, something had happened. The notebook had fallen twice, and someone had claimed to be the law. The sentence lingered in the air like smoke, curling with menace even after the speaker's lips had closed. "In here, I am the law." It hadn't been yelled. It didn't need volume. What it had instead was density, the kind of weight that pressed against the skin, against the chest, against the walls. Naomi didn't blink. She didn't move. She simply stood there, notebook pressed against her chest, the silence folding itself around her like a cloak. But a silence like that doesn't last forever. It never does. Somewhere in the back row of the courtroom, a thumb twitched. He was barely noticed. A law student, maybe 20, was seated behind the last aisle rail. He had slipped in just before the hearing was scheduled to start, wearing a university windbreaker and carrying a backpack that now sat unopened at his feet. His name wasn't important yet. What mattered was the flick of his thumb across the screen of his phone, the way his forefinger hesitated for only a second before pressing record. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't planned. It was instinct. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, the kind of tension that made animals still in the wild. He didn't know exactly what he was seeing, but he knew it mattered. The red dot blinked. The camera focused. Kellerman's hand was still on Naomi's shoulder, fingers curled with a force that suggested restraint in name only. Her lips moved again, tight, unyielding. "You have the right to remain silent," she said, and though it echoed the Miranda phrase, it came out hollow, contorted. Naomi's hands were now clasped in front of her, not clenched, folded, deliberate, composed, as if even at 12 she understood that the margin for perception was thinner than the space between a blink and a bullet. She bowed her head slightly, just enough to show the slope of her neck, her eyes angled toward the floor, not in shame, not in surrender, but in calculated de-escalation. It was a stance, a signal. She was shrinking the target, not giving up. The notebook had fallen again, and this time the sound it made, a flat slap on tile, cracked across the quiet like a gunshot. It echoed, not loudly, but with finality. It was the kind of sound that stayed in a room long after it stopped. The student's camera caught it clearly, not just the sound itself, but the jerk of shoulders around the courtroom, the flicker of heads turning, the sharp intake of breath from someone too far away to help. The camera steadied. Kellerman didn't pick the notebook up this time. Her hand moved instead to Naomi's back, palm pressing between her shoulders like a brand. Her voice dropped lower. "You can keep your mouth shut she said, lips curling at the edge. Or be made to. The words were cold. Not dramatic, not performed, but cold. The kind of cold that left no room for misunderstanding. Naomi remained still. The notebook remained where it had fallen. The camera panned slightly, not by design. The student's hand had trembled, whether from fear or fury he wouldn't know until later. But the accidental shift revealed more than expected. The profile of Kellerman, her mouth half open in mid-sentence, and something else. The corner of her lips tilted upward in a sneer, a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. No confidence, not pride, something more corrosive. Satisfaction. The slow crawl of the lens caught it. The light from the overhead beam sliced diagonally across her cheek, highlighting the cruel curve of her smirk. Her chin was slightly lifted, the tilt of power. The gesture wasn't loud, but it was lethal. She believed herself untouchable. Untouchable people move differently. Their bodies don't flinch. Their jaws stay relaxed. Their smiles are timed to hurt, not to soothe. The student didn't breathe. Not loudly, not at all. The video kept rolling. Naomi's voice returned. Quiet, taut, beautiful in its composure. "I told you," she said without lifting her head. "I'm just waiting for my father. He's on his way." The phrasing was surgical. The just stripped away the accusation. The waiting left no space for obstruction. And the final clause, "he's on his way," wasn't a threat, only inevitability. But inevitability in a girl's voice could feel like prophecy, especially when the room had already swallowed its silence in shame. The young officer who had previously stepped forward remained frozen near the gallery rail, his eyes flicking between Naomi's small frame and the steel set of Kellerman's jaw. He didn't intervene. He couldn't. He had seen that smirk. He had heard the tone. And somewhere in the buried machinery of his conscience, he understood if he moved now, he wouldn't just be defying rank, he'd be exposing the room. 38 seconds. That was the final length of the video. Long enough to capture everything essential, short enough to loop in the mind like a punishment. It held the moment of physical contact. It caught the words that could not be unsaid. It documented the notebook's second fall. And most damning of all, it caught the look, that slight upward curl of Kellerman's lips as she leaned over the 12-year-old girl and said, "You have the right to be kept silent." The camera stopped recording, not with a press, but with a stutter. The student had fumbled. His hands were shaking, not because he feared retribution, but because the temperature of the room had dropped by degrees no thermostat could register. He knew he had filmed something no classroom could prepare him to interpret. Not yet. There was no outcry, no uproar. Not yet. The room stayed still. The girl stayed standing. The notebook fell, but the footage had been captured. And though none of them knew it yet, in that courtroom, frozen in silence, cloaked in protocol, justice had just found its first weapon. Not a gavel, not a badge, a recording. A red dot, and the echo of a smirk that would not survive sunlight. The weight of Kellerman's words still clung to the courtroom walls like the last hiss of a storm that hadn't finished ruining the land beneath it. Naomi stood motionless, her notebook back in hand, her eyes fixed not on the woman before her, but on the empty doorway beyond. And then, with no announcement, no clatter of heels, and no herald but the vacuum left by justice withheld too long, the side door to the courtroom creaked open. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't slam or echo, but it silenced everything. A man stepped through. He wore a suit the color of ash, unpolished, precise, without flair. His gait was measured, the kind that didn't need to draw attention, because the silence around him already had. The shoulders of his coat sat square. His collar was pressed flat. A single white handkerchief folded into his breast pocket peeked out like punctuation, not decoration. The man did not scan the room. He did not make eyes. He walked as if the walls already knew him, as if time itself had made room in its spine for his presence. Luther D. Hayes had arrived. He moved through the space like an answer entering a question, and though his pace was slow, there was nothing unsure about it. Each step landed with the quiet of inevitability. By the time he reached the aisle, the courtroom was no longer a room. It was a vessel holding its breath. A judge seated at the front table looked up and instinctively removed his glasses, the tremble in his fingers betraying a recognition that needed no explanation. No one said his name. They didn't have to. In rooms like this, titles were often worn like armor, shouted to cover for what the voice lacked. But Hayes didn't wear his title. It followed him, invisible but palpable, a second spine of authority no one dared question. Kellerman hadn't moved. Her hand was no longer on Naomi's shoulder, but her arms hung stiff by her sides, as though gravity had become too aggressive. She didn't speak, but the color had drained from her face, and her jaw, so quick to snap before, was locked behind a silence she couldn't bend. She looked at him like someone watching the horizon break open, not with awe, but with the realization that the storm she thought she controlled was never hers to begin with. Hayes did not acknowledge her. He walked past, his eyes straight ahead, his expression unreadable. When he reached the bench where his daughter stood, he stopped, not with hesitation but with precision, and sat beside her. His movements were exact, quiet, as though even gravity deferred to him. Naomi turned her head and he looked at her, his face softening by a fraction. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he asked the question that mattered. "What did you write in your notebook?" Naomi opened the cover. She turned the pages, not nervously, not hurriedly, until she reached the one she wanted. She held it up. The ink was neat. The text was clear. At the top, underlined twice, was the title of a statute, Federal Protection of Juvenile Witnesses Under the Age of 15. Hayes read it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once. His hand rested lightly on his knee, his other palm flat on the bench beside her, anchoring them both. His gaze swept forward, toward the judge who had yet to regain the composure to speak, toward the officers and assistants, now stiff as statues, in uniforms that suddenly felt ornamental. Then he turned slightly, only slightly, enough to face the woman who had gripped his daughter like a threat, enough to force her to look at him. Kellerman met his eyes. She had no choice. Her breath stuttered in her chest. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked smaller, not in stature, in certainty. Her posture, so rigid just moments before, began to fracture. Her chin dipped, her eyes fluttered. There was no volume in the exchange, just that look. And whatever she saw there stripped her of pretense. Still, Hayes did not raise his voice. His words were sculpted from restraint. He turned back to Naomi, placed 2 fingers gently on her notebook, and asked, "You showed this to her?" Naomi nodded. Keem looked at it and pushed it away. Hayes exhaled through his nose, long and slow, a breath not of fatigue, but of discipline. When he spoke next, his voice was not sharp, but it had the gravity of a gavel striking steel. "Then this room," he said, "has seen what it needs." A ripple of movement passed through the gallery, a clerk adjusting papers with unnecessary energy, a bailiff shifting weight from one leg to the other, but no one dared break the silence outright. It wasn't permission they feared lacking, it was relevant. In that moment, no one else mattered. Hayes straightened in his seat. He looked ahead, not at Kellerman, not at the judge. He looked at the space where authority had once been claimed falsely and now stood corrected. He did not need to raise his voice because his presence made the room lean in. "I'm here today," he said, "as a father." The phrase landed with surgical force. It cut, it calibrated, it removed the mask of power and replaced it with something heavier, responsibility. He paused. His eyes remained steady. Then he added, "Tomorrow morning, I return as the Attorney General." And with that sentence, the courtroom exhaled, not from relief, from realization. It was not the volume of the words that mattered, it was their calibration. No one had interrupted Kellerman. No one had filmed the girl to protect her. No one had spoken on Naomi's behalf when her voice was ignored. But now someone had spoken after her, not for her. And the difference was the line between silence and justice. Kellerman didn't speak. She couldn't. There are moments in life when silence isn't surrender, it's a sentence. Hayes didn't look at her again. He didn't need to. The sentence, "Tomorrow morning I return as the Attorney General," still echoed faintly in the bones of the room, not as sound, but as pressure. It had left no space for applause, no room for gasps. It closed the air like a sealed envelope. The courtroom sat inside that silence, as if entombed by it, and for a moment time stalled, not dramatically, but absolutely. No one spoke, not a clerk, not a bailiff, not the judge. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, absorbing the gravity of presence, of power spoken unembellished without ceremony. There were no camera shutters, no buzzing whispers, only stillness. Hayes didn't move. Naomi didn't move. The two of them, father and daughter, formed an axis around which the whole room tilted, unbalanced and exposed. Kellerman, who only moments before had stood over a 12-year-old like a sovereign over a subject, now stood beneath something far heavier than backlash. She stood beneath the weight of clarity. Her mouth opened slightly, not to speak, but as if the mechanics of breathing had become a conscious task. Her hands had settled at her sides like useless tools, and her feet shifted only because standing still under that kind of gaze required muscles that no training had taught her. She tried. Of course she tried. She lifted her chin a fraction, habit, not confidence, and began the performance of restoration, the awkward reassembly of command. She adjusted her uniform jacket as if it still conferred legitimacy, as if her authority hadn't just been vacuumed out in front of every eye in the room. But the effort stuttered. Her voice, when it came, was brittle. I was only doing my duty. It wasn't loud, it wasn't proud. It was the voice of someone halfway between defense and disbelief, hoping one would sound like the other. Hayes looked at her. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his chin or narrow his gaze. He simply looked. The kind of look that doesn't ask permission, doesn't explain itself, doesn't need to. It was a look born from too many years in rooms like this one, watching people like Kellerman believe that fear and structure were synonyms. His voice was quiet, but it struck like a cold blade across stone. Do you even understand what you touched? The words didn't accuse, they didn't dramatize, they simply stripped. And Kellerman, stripped of badge, tone, and certainty, stood in the center of the courtroom, drowning in silence. She blinked too quickly. He followed procedure, she said, trying to anchor herself in familiarity, but the words landed thin, hollow. She wasn't supposed to be there. Page said nothing. Naomi rose. She didn't need prompting. She didn't need timing. She stood with the calm grace of someone who knew the floor beneath her wouldn't give. Her notebook was pressed to her chest, but her voice was clear, soft, and crystalline. "Yes, ma'am," Naomi said gently. "You followed it exactly the way they taught you." The room didn't react. It couldn't. There was nothing to react with. Naomi's tone wasn't angry. It wasn't righteous. It was surgical, not pitying, not forgiving. Just true. Kellerman didn't respond, because what could she say to that? The silence expanded again, but this time it had shape, contour. It stretched between two poles, the collapse of justification and the stillness of conviction. One uniformed body trying to patch the seams of a broken image. One child and one man standing so still, so composed, they made the truth undeniable by simply refusing to deny it. Across the room, the judge shifted, his robe swaying slightly as he leaned forward. His mouth opened, but the words didn't arrive. Maybe a gesture of order, maybe an attempt to de-escalate, maybe the reflex of someone too used to filling the void with polite authority. But Hayes turned his head, not fast, not sharp, just enough, and raised a single hand in quiet restraint. The gesture wasn't dramatic, it wasn't theatrical, but it was absolute, and the judge stopped. Not because he agreed, not because he was cowed, but because some silences aren't meant to be interrupted. Some silences are verdicts in themselves. Hayes turned back toward Kellerman. He didn't step forward. He didn't threaten. He simply let the silence settle again, denser, colder. Silence, he said, not loudly, can be complicity. And there it was. Not a speech, a closing argument, a sentence, a ruling, a fact. The cameras in the courtroom, which had been activated automatically by court policy, captured every frame. The fixed security lens caught Naomi's eyes, still, level, unflinching. It caught Hayes's profile, sculpted in shadow and resolve. It caught Kellerman's shoulders rounding just slightly inward, as if her body had finally registered what her mind had not dared admit, that this was not a misunderstanding, not an overreach. It was a reckoning, and every word, every syllable of the exchange was stored, backed up, and time-stamped. No edit, no commentary, just the truth, preserved like evidence. Naomi turned her head toward her father and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hands were still steady, her breath was even, and Hayes, sensing the moment had yielded all it needed, placed one hand lightly on her back, not to guide, not to protect, but to confirm they were finished here. Kellerman did not move. She remained upright, breathing through her nose, holding her position by willpower alone. She would tell herself later that this wasn't a defeat, that she had stood her ground, that silence wasn't an admission. But everyone in that room would remember differently. They would remember a girl who said 6 words and turned a system's reflection on itself. They would remember a father who spoke only what the moment demanded and nothing more. They would remember the woman in uniform who tried to stand tall and instead stood alone. That's how silence weighs, not in volume, is in consequence. It began not with a siren, not with a televised address, not with a headline. It began with an email, time-stamped at 6:00 IEM exactly, issued from the Office of the Attorney General, bearing an encrypted header marked in red, level code, MA1. Subject, emergency review, unlawful coercion of minor witness. There were no adjectives, no sentiment, just language calibrated like a scalpel. The subject line alone made the internal distribution system lock temporarily. Red Mage messages did not arrive often, and when they did, they were not to be questioned. They were to be implemented. The directive ran straight to the inbox of the county sheriff, flagged for priority clearance, attached with a reference to Article 1288C of the Civil Oversight Statutes, Subsection B, actionable orders involving underage witness protection protocol. The sheriff read it twice. His eyes didn't blink the first time. The second time, he swallowed hard. The third time, he called his deputy and told him to stop Kellerman before she reached the building. Lieutenant Martha Kellerman had not yet clocked in for the morning shift. She was driving along the main highway, uniform pressed, name tag clean, the weight of the previous day still rattling inside her skull like a penny in a tin can. She hadn't slept. Not well. She told herself it was fatigue, not fear, but even fatigue doesn't explain the reflex that made her glance at every cruiser she passed. At 6:13 a.m., just as she turned into the precinct lot, her radio crackled. "Lieutenant Kellerman, please report to command control, immediate." No tone, no explanation. She parked, left the engine running for a moment, then turned it off. Inside, the air had changed. Not loudly. There was no shouting, no running, just a kind of rehearsed efficiency, the pace of an institution that had been made to remember it was being watched. Kellerman stepped through the sliding doors. At the front desk, Officer Raleigh didn't look up. The sergeant to her right nodded once, stiffly, but said nothing. That was new. That meant something. She walked past them, down the corridor, left at Internal Affairs. When she entered the command control briefing room, she saw 4 people. None of them smiled. Deputy Chief Morales was standing behind the long table. Captain Yates had a folder open in front of him, though he wasn't reading it. Next to him was a man from Legal Oversight, laptop open, blinking cursor active, and seated at the far end was a compliance officer from the state. Her presence announced nothing, but her badge declared everything. The screen on the wall displayed the subject line of the email, large, unignorable, highlighted in crimson, verification of extrajudicial force against juvenile witness in active legal space. Kellerman sat. She didn't ask why she was called in. She didn't ask what this was about, because the answer was already staring her down. Morales spoke first. "The Office of the Attorney General has issued a formal directive," he said, voice as neutral as a judge's gavel. "We've been ordered to release all data logs from the last 5 years related to juvenile detainment, courtroom removal, and witness suppression." He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The compliance officer added, "That includes any non-standard removal procedures used within courthouse facilities or by personnel acting under independent judgment." Kellerman said nothing. Yates turned a page. Her voice finally emerged. "Am I being suspended?" "No," Morales replied. "You're being retained. Until further notice, all duties are frozen. You are not to perform, authorize, or respond in any case involving witness handling or courtroom presence." Kellerman stared at the red letters on the screen. She clenched her jaw. "You're overreacting. I enforced the procedure." The legal officer didn't raise his head. "The question isn't whether the procedure was followed. The question is whether it was constitutional." And there it was, the shift. The procedure no longer shielded anyone. It was now the exhibit. Yates stood, walked to the secure terminal along the right wall. He inserted his ID card, typed a passphrase, then turned to her. "You'll be shown the log request now. You are to provide access to all reports filed under your badge number regarding minors during courtroom activity, surveillance tapes, incident memos, use of force justifications." He paused. "Your badge has been tagged for historical review. 5-year span." Kellerman said, "Too fast. 5 years? Starting with your first day in courtroom rotation." The compliance officer leaned forward slightly. "A live tracker is monitoring the response. If logs are missing, you will be asked to explain why. If those explanations do not satisfy compliance standards, you will be referred to internal judicial review or beyond." A long pause settled. In another room on the second floor, a secure database was already being opened. A team of forensic analysts had arrived at 5:45 a.m. Their job was not to interpret, only to retrieve. Every entry Kellerman had touched, signed, edited, or approved was now queued. The system's audit trail showed no erasure, but it did show flags, gaps in the metadata, inconsistencies in tagging, and strange timing anomalies in report closure. By 6:48 a.m., 23 of her case logs had been marked for deep-level compliance cross-check. At 6:51 a.m., a biographical report she'd signed off on, just 9 months prior, was flagged by the algorithm for terminology deviation inconsistent with federal witness protection guidelines. By 6:55 a.m., a backup server call had been placed to extract all body cam footage submitted under her command. None of this was loud. None of this was visible from the front desk, but the department felt it. Downstairs, in the internal ops wing, 2 officers who had served on Kellerman's shift the previous year sat in an unlit hallway, waiting to be called. One of them whispered, "It's real. The AG's office just opened the old logs." The other replied without humor, "Then this ain't a review, this is a sweep." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was a calculation. Everyone knew the chain. Logs lead to footage. Footage leads to transcripts. Transcripts lead to behavior. And behavior, when put under federal inspection, didn't bend. It broke. By 7:02 a.m., the duty logs for the courthouse unit had been frozen. By 7:08 a.m., the incident register for the date of Naomi Hayes' courtroom encounter had been set to read only and forwarded to external counsel. Someone in internal affairs exhaled as they hit send and muttered under their breath, "This just became something else." Kellerman remained seated. Her fingers didn't twitch, but her lips, those lips that had once curled into smirks and commands, were now drawn tight across silence. He asked no further questions, because the system had already started answering for her. It began with 13 files, not reports, no complaints, files, each one bearing the tag, "Closed." No further action required. Each one was stamped with an internal code for low-priority reassessment, and each one sharing a name, Lieutenant M. Kellerman. By 8:20 a.m., an internal review team assembled on the 6th floor of the Department of Justice's Civil Oversight Division had received a direct request from the Office of the Attorney General. The language was simple. Reopen case files related to juvenile interaction and coercion, bearing the signature of Kellerman Marta ETA. It was not phrased as a question. It was not wrapped in pleasantries. It came with a digital key that unlocked a restricted partition of the judicial archive, a space only accessed when the presumption of trust had been revoked. 13 files emerged. Most had not been touched in years. Some had been closed within 48 hours of being opened. None had led to disciplinary action. Yet all bore the telltale signs of procedural irregularity, absence of physical evidence, lack of cross-review, and in several cases, a curious absence of the original audio transcript. But one wasn't missing. One had been quietly archived under a low visibility tag. Verbal incident, no escalation. In it was a clipped audio file, less than a minute. The date is stamped 2 years earlier. The voice was unmistakable. You think just 'cause you're somebody now, you get to talk to me like that? Shut your effing mouth before I put you on the floor. The target of the threat was a 17-year-old black male, brought in as a witness to a petty vandalism case that had unraveled into something more serious when he refused to sign a pre-sippled statement. His name wasn't relevant anymore. What mattered now was the voice in that room, and that voice belonged to Kellerman. Her tone wasn't raised. It wasn't out of control. It was controlled, weaponized. The file had been signed off on within hours. No further action taken. Not even a warning was entered into her record. The supervisor listed on the disposition form Captain Vernon J. Dale. 4 other cases under Dale's signature were reopened the same morning. Each had been closed without deposition, one within 36 hours of filing. All involved juveniles. All included Kellerman's name as the responding officer, and in each case the pattern repeated. Rapid closure, absence of disciplinary notation, supervisor override in lieu of escalation. At 9:27 a.m., Luther D. Hayes stepped into the oversight review room. He didn't come with fanfare. He didn't bring cameras. He brought 3 words. Where are they? The staffer at the front desk stood. Sir, we've isolated 13 files, all under Code Level 4. 4 of them contain decision-level irregularities. I want them all, Hayes said. Printed, not summarized. Originals only. Within 30 minutes, a legal aide laid them out on the long table under warm fluorescence. The paper was thin, the content wasn't. Hayes read them without speaking. His eyes flicked between memos, timelines, and marginal notes. The only sound was the quiet tick of the wall clock. Then he paused. His hand landed on one particular report. A single sentence near the bottom had been circled in black pen. Behavioral infraction likely due to unclear command direction. The handwriting wasn't Kellerman's. It wasn't the witness's. It was Captain Dale's. Hayes tapped the page once. Circle this in red. Highlight it. A legal analyst leaned in and did as asked. The circle, now crimson, stood out like a wound reopened. Then Hayes spoke. His voice did not rise, but every syllable hit with the rhythm of strategy, not rhetoric. I need to know, he said, whether this was one officer misunderstanding the law or if an entire system understood it and ignored it anyway. No one replied, not because they didn't want to, because they knew the room had changed shapes. It was no longer a workspace. It was now a tribunal in the making. Captain Vernon Dale's name appeared again. Every form, every signature line, every closed per supervisor review bore his pen. No digital override, no collaborative approval. Just one man's sign-off again and again. At 10:41 IEM, Hayes ordered a formal requisition of Dale's original handwritten logs, not the typed reports, the journals, the legal pad margins, the unofficial pages that command-level officers used before the cleanup. The request was sent via encrypted internal courier marked Tier 1 Direct to Compliance. 37 minutes later, 2 leather-bound notebooks arrived. Inside were notes from courthouse rotations, lineups, and administrative decisions made during trial delays. Amid them, under a dated heading 2 years prior, was the following phrase: Redirected complaint. Too much noise on this one. Cleared by Friday. Hayes circled it twice. "This is not about one day," he said. No one argued, because now it wasn't Kellerman under review. It was the spine of everything that had allowed her to speak that way, act that way, close those cases, and walk back into work each morning without a question asked. Hayes turned to his aide. "Summon Dale." A pause. Today, Hayes didn't look up. He will not sleep through this. Outside the oversight room, down the corridor, in compliance holding, an assistant whispered to her colleague, "You hear what they found?" The other answered without turning around. Hayes isn't building a case. Pause. He's building a precedent, and that, more than any headline, any news cycle, any quote, was what made the walls begin to sweat. It was a routine morning briefing, on the calendar at least. The chairs in the operations room were filled, the projection screen ready, and the coffee was still bitter from the overnight pot. But nothing about the posture in the room was normal. The conversation was clipped, sparse, punctuated by side eyes and silence. No one said her name aloud, but they didn't need to. Her shadow had already arrived. At 7:59 a.m., Lieutenant Martha Kellerman stepped into the briefing room wearing her full uniform. It was pressed perfectly, the gold insignia pinned square to her collarbone, the badge polished like always. Her boots didn't squeak. Her eyes didn't blink. She had survived worse stares than these, or so she told herself. But the air wasn't cold. It was clinical, and when the door clicked shut behind her, she realized no one had offered her a seat. At the front of the room, beside the precinct's second-in-command, stood a man in a dark suit. He didn't introduce himself. His jacket stayed buttoned, his hands rested at his sides, and his expression never wavered. When he spoke, his voice was dry, formal, in a way that made rank feel irrelevant. "Lieutenant Kellerman," he said, "I'm Special Agent Randall Cole, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She didn't flinch. She had heard the cadence before. She had used it herself when cornering suspects, too slow to recognize what tone meant. But it felt different now. Not heavier, cleaner, like metal drawn straight from a cold forge. "We are executing a federal directive, issued this morning by order of the Department of Justice," Cole continued. "You are instructed to relinquish your badge and sidearm, effective immediately, under Title 18, subsection 214, obstruction and coercion involving protected juvenile witnesses under federal review." There were no gasps, just stillness. The badge on her chest seemed to grow heavier by the second. Kellerman exhaled, the sound sharp in the still air. "You're making this bigger than it is." Cole didn't blink. "No, Lieutenant, you already did." She didn't reach for the badge right away. Her fingers hovered, then retreated. Not in refusal, more like delay. Her mouth tightened. "This is political," she said, almost to herself. Cole didn't move. "This is law." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an argument. It was a sentence, and the room absorbed it like stone. Finally, she unfastened the clasp. Her badge came off slower than usual, as if the metal resisted. It clicked faintly as she laid it on the table. Her weapon followed. One motion, practiced, professional, but her hands lingered just long enough to betray the tremor in her wrist. Agent Cole reached forward and picked up the items without fanfare. He did not gloat. He did not explain further. He simply turned slightly and nodded to the second officer at the door. A pause, then a voice over the radio. "Unit Bravo, escort is ready." And then the hallway. The hallway wasn't long, but that morning it may as well have been a runway through judgment. 2 officers flanked her, standard procedure, not cuffed, not touched, just walked. But everything about the moment screamed exception, not routine. The linoleum floor was too polished, the fluorescent lights are too white, even the air smelled sterile, like the building itself was trying to disinfect what she had left behind. No one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was practiced, heavy. There were uniformed officers she had trained, supervisors she had once corrected, and juniors who had once stood straighter when she passed. None made eye contact now. Some didn't even pretend to type. They just watched. Somewhere above the main atrium, a red light blinked quietly on a broadcast camera. Local station. probably called in when the federal transport van parked unannounced. The lens caught everything. Kellerman's face, composed but pale, the empty holster at her hip, the cold distance between her and the officers walking alongside her. There were no words exchanged because none were needed. Her silence had said enough. Her badge now said nothing. At the far end of the hallway stood two figures, motionless. Naomi Hayes, 12 years old, in a plain charcoal coat over a school blouse, stood next to her father. She did not fidget. She did not shift. She did not look at Kellerman, not even when the corridor narrowed and their distance became a closing space. Luther D. Hayes, dressed not in his private suit but in the muted federal gray befitting a man who no longer walked as a father but as the Attorney General, stood beside his daughter, one hand behind his back, the other resting on a closed folder under his arm. Kellerman saw them, and in that moment the walk changed. She didn't falter. She didn't trip, but the weight of each step seemed to double. The air around them tightened. She could feel it pressing inward, not like guilt, not like fear, more like exposure, like standing under an X-ray too strong to argue with. The corridor that had always been hers, the territory she once patrolled like a queen in uniform, had become a passage she was merely passing through, temporary, observed, documented. As they crossed paths, Naomi remained still, her chin slightly raised, eyes forward, jaw set not in anger but in absolute composure. Her silence did not vibrate with revenge. It hummed with principle. And Kellerman, for the first time in years, found herself unsure of how to carry her shoulders. She glanced not directly, but enough to know the girl would not flinch, would not nod, would not acknowledge, because Naomi owed her nothing. And Luther Hayes, he didn't glare, he didn't speak, but his presence was louder than any verdict she had ever heard read aloud in court. Kellerman passed them without speaking. Her gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, the kind of involuntary gesture a person makes when their reflex to assess threat meets a threat that doesn't blink. The child didn't move. The man beside her didn't step forward, and that made it worse, because neither of them needed to shift to hold ground. Kellerman felt that truth like static clinging to her skin. Unshakable, clinging to her even after she'd already passed by. The camera tracked her, down the corridor, through the final set of glass doors, into the public atrium, where the press pool had started to gather in quiet confusion. No one shouted questions yet. There were no microphones shoved in her face. This wasn't a walk of shame built for headlines. It wasn't engineered. It was simply happening, raw, unembellished, and that's what made it more brutal. The public didn't need spectacles anymore. They had context. They had 38 seconds of recorded video and a 12-year-old girl's notebook. That was all it had taken to bring the gears of accountability out of hibernation. The press didn't need a quote today. They just needed a visual, and Kellerman, now without badge or weapon, provided it. She kept walking. Her jaw was tight. Her spine tried to stay straight, but even her posture had begun to waver, just barely, just enough to be real. Her arms hung stiff by her sides, fingers twitching like they were searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left to grip. Behind her, the heavy glass doors clicked shut. Inside, Hayes lowered his eyes toward Naomi. "You all right?" he asked, not as Attorney General, not as the man who signed the federal order that morning, just as her father. Naomi nodded. Her eyes didn't leave the hallway, even though the person it contained had gone. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. What had needed saying had already passed. When she had stood still while power walked past her and saw itself reflected in her refusal to move, a producer from the local news channel checked his feed and whispered to his cameraman, "Got the shot?" The cameraman didn't answer, just nodded. It was all there. The walk, the silence. The freeze frame was when Kellerman passed the girl and looked, but never looked back. It was more than news. It was evidence. And evidence doesn't ask for applause. It waits to be filed. Outside, the transport van idled at the curb. Plain white, no markings, no sirens. Not an arrest vehicle. just a carrier for transition. Two agents waited, hands folded at their waists, eyes shaded by sunglasses that didn't need badges to command compliance. They didn't greet Kellerman. They didn't ask her name. She had already been identified. She stepped forward without being told. Her steps echoed off the sidewalk like empty percussion. No rhythm, no destination, just movement. One of the agents opened the rear door. She paused, just for a second. Not to resist, not to reconsider, but to register. This wasn't dramatic. This wasn't a defeat. It was a process. She climbed in. The door closed behind her with a smooth, solid click. No metal slam. No flash, just finality. Across the street, behind tinted windows on the third floor of the courthouse, a deputy watched through the blinds and whispered, "That's the last time she'll walk out of here like that." No one answered, because some truths are too obvious to require agreement. Inside the van, Kellerman sat alone. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers no longer twitching. There was nothing left to adjust. Her badge was gone, her weapon turned in. Her name, once spoken with a mixture of fear and respect in precinct corridors, was now archived under a new label, subject of inquiry. But she wasn't thinking about labels now. She was thinking about eyes, not the ones staring at her, the ones that didn't meet her on the walk. The girl's eyes, still, her calm, unmoved. She hadn't even turned her head. That silence, that refusal to give her even a flicker of acknowledgement, had done more damage than any shouted accusation. It had told the world, you are not worthy of a reaction. And for a woman who had lived her entire career provoking them, bending them, extracting them, being denied one was the sharpest verdict of all. As the van pulled away, the courthouse faded behind her. No one watched it leave. Naomi and Hayes had already gone back inside. There were no victory laps, no press conference, just a hallway left, slightly quieter than before, and a name, Kellerman. That no longer carried weight, but the echo of its unraveling. The hallway had quieted. The doors had closed, and the cameras had long since stopped blinking. But Naomi Hayes was not finished. Because long before any of them had seen her as a witness, she had already written herself into the story, as a recorder, not just a survivor. She sat now, alone at the kitchen table, a cup of warm tea beside her, untouched. Her notebook lay open, not the old one, the one from the courtroom, the one that had already been immortalized on every screen in the country, but a different one, newer, thicker, bound in dark green cloth with no label on the front, no title to call attention to it. She didn't need a title. She knew what it was. She wrote slowly. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because every word mattered. Her handwriting was neat, each letter upright, deliberate. The page she was working on had a heading already written in all caps, underlined twice. Entry, the day a badge got quiet. Below that she wrote, "Justice doesn't bow. It leans, so the hurt don't have to shout." She looked at the sentence for a moment, reread it, then drew a small box around it. That was her way. Boxes meant truth, not just opinion, not just an impression, truth. For Naomi, the courtroom had never been just a room. It had been a system of angles, how people stood where they pointed when they looked away. And while others kept their eyes on the judge or the badge or the verdict, Naomi had been watching posture, silence, the pauses between words. She had been writing it all down since the first time her father had let her sit in the back of a trial. She had only been 9 then. The notebook she'd filled that year was labeled, "People who look away when it matters." No one had asked her to document anything. No one had told her to take notes. But some part of her had known. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something her father had planted years earlier, during those quiet Saturday breakfasts when he said, "The law isn't a sword. It's a shield for people who don't have anything sharp to fight with." She had written that down, too. She still remembered the first time she'd heard a grown man use the phrase collateral inconvenience to describe a witness being removed from court. She was 10. The notebook from that year had an entire section called Words That Cover Truth. It listed phrases like procedural discretion, non-essential presence, and failure to comply. She had boxed them all, and under each one she'd written in red ink what they mean, because Naomi had long since learned that justice didn't always lie, it just spoke in code. Now, at 12, she didn't just write to remember, she wrote to reveal, not for the press, not for the case, not even for the headlines that now bore her words as if they were slogans. She wrote because, in her mind, every adult who walked into a courtroom had a weapon they carried in their language. Her notebook was the only thing she had to block it. On the next page, she wrote a new entry. There are people who walk into rooms looking for who belongs. And some people walk in knowing they do. Kellerman thought she could decide the difference. She didn't. All right. She paused, then wrote beneath it, "Power isn't how loud your voice is, it's how quiet people get when you speak." That line stayed with her. She boxed it. Across the room, Hayes stood in the doorway. He had been watching her write for several minutes, saying nothing. This wasn't the kind of work you interrupted. She didn't like to be asked what she was writing, not until she was done. She didn't need editing. She didn't need protection. She just needed space. "Can I sit?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded. He took the chair opposite her, folded his hands on the table, and studied her for a moment, not as an officer of the law, not as the Attorney General, not even as a father weighing whether to worry, but as a man trying to understand what kind of steel it took for a girl to hold a system still just by documenting it. "You remember what I told you last year?" he asked. Naomi nodded again. "About the shield?" Hayes smiled faintly. "You changed the shape of it, you know." Naomi looked down at her notebook. "I didn't change it," she said. "I just showed people where it was dented." They both sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved the trees, and somewhere down the street a car door slammed. But the room itself stayed still. Naomi flipped back to the beginning of the notebook and read quietly through some of her earliest entries. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She didn't skip pages. Each one held a moment someone else had tried to forget. She had written them so they wouldn't. On the final page of her last notebook, the one that now sat in evidence storage, she had written a line she hadn't shared with anyone yet. Even Hayes hadn't seen it, but she remembered it by heart. "If the law forgets the small, it forgets itself." That was the line that mattered. That was the line that had turned her from a witness into a writer of record. The room wasn't large, but it felt like the center of the world. It was a converted media briefing hall inside the Department of Justice, meant for procedural updates and prepared statements. Nothing about it was built for history. The lighting was flat, the chairs utilitarian, the backdrop a simple seal against a pale blue wall. But none of that mattered. Not when Naomi Hayes stepped up to the podium alone. She didn't wear anything dramatic. A white shirt, a navy skirt, her hair pulled back, no makeup, no pin, no signs of identity beyond the name tag that read Naomi. It was clipped to her left side, slightly crooked. She didn't fix it. A dozen cameras were trained on her. 3 rows of reporters sat silently, notebooks open but untouched. No one wanted to miss the first word. She took a breath, then another, then spoke. "They said I was sitting in the wrong seat." That was it, just that, and the silence that followed was thunderous. "I was told that space was for guardians, adults, people who had the right to be there. But if justice has a seat, if fairness has a place to sit, who decides where it belongs? Who decided I didn't? Was he right? Was he wrong? Sometimes I think that it was justice and I didn't know what to do or say." Her voice didn't shake. She didn't raise it, but the force behind it could have shattered every gavel in the building. Naomi glanced down briefly at the notes she hadn't written. The paper on the podium was blank. That was intentional. "I didn't come here to accuse. That part's already done. I didn't come here to plead. I'm not asking for permission. I'm not even asking to be heard, because I know now people listen when they're forced to be quiet. So I'm going to say this just once, and not again." She leaned in slightly. "If the system thinks someone like me needs to ask where to sit, then maybe the system is the one that's lost its place." No movement in the room. No clicks, no whispers. Even the sound technician had stopped adjusting dials. Naomi continued. Some said I was brave, that I held my ground. But that's not what happened. What happened was, I remembered what my father taught me. The law is not a weapon, it is a shield, and shields don't work unless someone is willing to hold them. Her hand tightened slightly around the podium edge. I held mine, that's all. She looked out at the cameras now fully, not into the lens, but through it, past the reporters, past the polished shoes and folded hands, to the people watching from screens at home, the ones who weren't invited into these rooms, the ones who didn't even know they were allowed. They called me a witness, she said, her tone flattening, sharpening. But I was a writer first. Every day in that courtroom I took notes, not because I wanted to remember, but because I knew the moment I left, people would try to forget. She reached into her bag and pulled out the original notebook, the one with the worn spine and corners soft from constant turning. She held it up for a moment, not for drama, just to prove it was real. This is not evidence, she said. It's memory, and memory is the only thing that doesn't need permission to exist. She placed the notebook gently on the podium and let her hand rest on it. After the pages says, "Justice doesn't whisper. It leans down to speak to those no one hears. I wrote that before any of you knew my name." Another breath. Then the final words, "I'm not here to make anyone feel better, or worse. I'm here to remind you there are more of me, and they're all watching, writing, waiting." She stepped back. No applause, no statement from her father, no questions from the press, just silence. And then the flashbulbs began, because the moment was over, but the message wasn't. The next day, the New York Times ran the headline in bold serif across the top of its front page. "If justice has a seat, who put it there?" And beneath that, a photograph of Naomi Hayes standing beside a notebook that looked like it weighed more than the building around her. But in the picture she was smiling, not with pride, not with relief, but with certainty. She had spoken. The world had no choice but to listen. The morning of the hearing began with no ceremonial welcome, no seal of gratitude, no patriotic score humming beneath the tension. Instead, a subdued chill clung to the polished oak of the Judiciary Oversight Committee's chamber. Rows of dark suits filled the gallery, their faces passive, their gazes controlled. The lights burned clinical and white, erasing all shadows but one, the figure seated at the center, alone at the witness table, Luther D. Hayes. He wore no robe, no insignia, just a fitted black suit buttoned precisely and a tie the shade of iron. His eyes scanned no one in particular. He didn't fidget, he didn't blink. He waited as one waits for a storm they knew was coming, one they built the shelter to withstand. Before him sat a panel of 11, senators, representatives, a few with eyes ready to indict, others calculating whether allegiance to the law was greater than allegiance to tradition. The chair of the committee, Senator Merrill of Illinois, opened the proceedings with a tone too smooth to be comforting. "We are here to determine whether the Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Luther Hayes, leveraged federal authority for personal retaliation." That word, retaliation, hung in the air like smoke from an old fire that refused to die. Cameras weren't permitted inside, but microphones were, and they didn't miss the quiet click of Hayes's pen landing softly on the folder in front of him. Senator Gray, a freshman representative from Alabama, leaned forward first, eager, too eager. "Mr. Hayes, you were present at the courthouse the morning of the Kellerman incident?" "Yes," Hayes said. His voice was level, neither cold nor cordial. It was the sound of steel being weighed, not drawn. Gray pounced. "And you intervened, personally, in the internal handling of a local police issue?" Hayes tilted his head slightly. "No," I responded as a father. "But the very next morning," Gray said, voice rising, "you issued a federal red file directive. You bypassed the regional review. You opened sealed complaints. You activated oversight protocols meant for systemic failures. Are you telling us that wasn't personal?" Hayes didn't move. His stillness spoke more than anger ever could. "I didn't Bypass. I executed authority legally housed within my office. The room held still. That word again, legally. He was daring them to challenge the definition. Senator Klein, older, seasoned, leaned on the table. Mr. Hayes, you were deeply affected by what occurred. Any father would be. But do you understand how it looks when the top legal officer of the country uses national channels to pursue a county officer within 24 hours? Yes, Hayes said again, this time quieter. Then why do it? He didn't blink. Because the law didn't move. So I did. A breath caught in someone's throat. The committee chair raised a brow. Hayes turned slowly to look at the panel directly, his voice lowering. Let's not confuse speed with revenge. The fact that it moved quickly doesn't mean it moved emotionally. The only thing that made this personal was the silence from those who were supposed to speak before I had to. Senator Gray scowled. You admit, then, that this case was exceptional because of your daughter? Hayes leaned forward now. The room tensed. His words came like a scalpel. No, Representative, it was exceptional because it was visible. What made it urgent was that my daughter knew to write it down. How many children didn't? How many notebooks never made it into evidence? It silenced even Gray for a second. Then came the pivot. So you think every claim should rise to federal escalation? No, Hayes said, unflinching. But I believe the law should not wait to see itself embarrassed before it corrects its posture. Senator Merrill interjected. Let's return to protocol. You used Section 17.8 emergency clause. That clause has only been triggered 4 times in 2 decades. One was a terrorist incident. Another involved a governor's corruption case. Do you believe Officer Kellerman's behavior justified that classification? Yes, Hayes answered. On what grounds? Hayes opened his folder. He didn't look at the papers, just placed his hand flat on them. Because systemic corrosion doesn't announce itself with explosives. It erodes in courtrooms, where a child is told her name badge is more offensive than misconduct. I acted because the badge that morning belonged to someone who thought their power exempted them from the law's reach. That is not local, that is federal. Another silence fell, the kind that only truths cause, not by their volume, but by the clarity that follows. And just as the next question was forming, Hayes cut in. You want to know if I'm angry? His voice barely rose. I am, but not for my child. I'm angry that this chamber only convened after the footage. The law had to be recorded to be respected, that the burden of proof now sits on the shoulders of a 12-year-old girl who didn't speak to win but to survive being silenced again. A pause. Then he delivered the line they'd remember, long after the hearing adjourned. I didn't retaliate. I reset the order. Because if the law has to ask permission to correct itself, it's not a law, it's performance. The hush that followed Hayes's words didn't ask for permission. It imposed itself. The panel members, suddenly stripped of rhetorical armor, adjusted their posture, some shifting in their chairs, others staring down at printed notes as if searching for forgotten authority. Hayes had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. The committee chamber, fortified by decades of decorum, had become a crucible for a truth too dense to ignore. Senator Vasquez, a sharp-witted legal scholar known for her aversion to political theatrics, leaned forward. Her tone was razor clean. Mr. Hayes, are you asserting that federal oversight should be normalized as a deterrent tool, not a reactive measure? Hayes did not flinch. I'm asserting that oversight is not optional when silence has become a protocol. She nodded once, acknowledging not agreement, but the weight of the argument. You realize, she continued, that redefining federal intervention in local jurisdictions will disrupt layers of precedents. Hayes raised an eyebrow, voice low. Precedence is not immunity. It's habit dressed as policy. That landed hard. Senator Gray, still smarting from Hayes's earlier counter, snapped, So you would dismantle the structure just to make a point? Hayes turned toward him now, eyes like frost under pressure. No, Representative, I would remind the structure of what it was built for. If it cannot withstand scrutiny, it was never built for justice. A ripple of unease moved through the panel. Behind the press barrier, pens hovered mid-sentence. Hayes continued, voice steady. We talk about justice like it's a destination, as if there's a clear road and a scheduled arrival. But for some of us, justice isn't a place. It's a moving target we've been told to chase barefoot. I didn't chase it. I built a line it could no longer ignore. Senator Merrill's gavel tapped once, not for order, but to mark the shift in tone. Let the record reflect Mr. Hayes' statement on the operational interpretation of federal authority in misconduct oversight. Major Mason, Napoleon, and Masterson engaged once more, but it was more than that. It was doctrine. Senator Lynn, a quiet presence until now, finally spoke. You've said the law must be a blade that cuts false justice. Who wields that blade when it turns against its arm? Hayes met his gaze. The people do, through those we elect, those we challenge, and sometimes those we raise. The law is not a fortress. It's a mirror, and too many refuse to look into it unless it flatters them. A silence deeper than decorum settled in. Even the stenographer's keys paused. Then one final question broke through. From Senator Monroe, a veteran of judicial reform. Would you do it again? Everything? If the name on that badge had been any other. Hayes didn't answer right away. He looked across the room where a small badge rested on the table before him, a simple laminated ID that read Naomi Hayes. Then he looked up, words as sharp as the morning verdict. I did not act because her name is Naomi Hayes. I acted because someday the name might be someone else's, and I refuse to leave a system intact that teaches our children their silence is safer than their truth. The room held its breath, not from awe, but from the slow realization that a line had been drawn, not just between power and accountability, but between legacy and rupture. Hayes's testimony was not just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. No longer could the veneer of jurisprudence shield those who had mistaken authority for impunity. A staffer wheeled in a cart stacked with archival boxes. Labeled dates spanned 2 decades. Subcommittee Chair Merrill nodded curtly. We'll now move to evidentiary review. He didn't need to say whose evidence. Everyone knew. Hayes had brought receipts, not rumors, not rhetoric, documents, transcripts, full-page redactions highlighted in piercing yellow, procedural gaps underlined in red ink. One document landed in front of Senator Gray with a soft but definite thud. It bore his name, not because he'd acted, but because he hadn't. His signature adorned a reauthorization of funds for juvenile oversight reductions in the same fiscal year. Complaints against the precinct increased 73%. Hayes didn't glance his way. He didn't need to. Truth had its own gravitational pull. A screen lowered behind the panel and Hayes gestured. Play clip 11. The footage that rolled wasn't dramatic. It was damning. A routine body cam recording, a 12-year-old boy, face pressed to pavement, handcuffed for non-compliance after asking to use the bathroom. The officer's tone was routine. The violence wasn't. It was systemic, casual, and uninterrupted. Pause, Hayes said. The freeze frame was clinical. The boy's cheek is red against concrete. This happened 34 days before Naomi Hayes was pulled from a courtroom bench. We've taught law enforcement to control before they understand, to suppress before they listen. Senator Vasquez murmured under her breath, and to forget before they are held accountable. Hayes heard. Exactly. And now we remember. He stepped back, but his words stayed lodged in the air like filings in a magnetic field. The cost of remembering is discomfort. The cost of forgetting is a future that forgets to protect. No one rebutted. They couldn't. Their playbook had been written for a different game, one where outrage was theoretical, where data could be diluted, where a child's voice could be folded under footnotes. But Hayes had bypassed the format. He had thrown the system's silence back into its hollow echo. He took his seat without theatrics. No applause, no bows, just the sound of systems being seen for what they were. Senator Darnell leaned forward, breaking the silence like glass underfoot. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, what you're suggesting, it borders on dismantling centuries of judicial structure." Hayes didn't flinch. "And what do you call a structure that withstands scrutiny only when it's unexamined? Tradition or tyranny?" A murmur traveled through the gallery, too contained to be noise, too charged to be silence. Darnell opened his mouth again, perhaps hoping his voice might regain ground where logic had failed. But Hayes was already ahead of him. "You call this a legal order. I call it a controlled dissent. Every rule you fail to enforce equally becomes an exception waiting to rot into standard." The senator stiffened, but his words were gone. Hayes's gaze didn't even pause on him. It passed through like a verdict already handed down. Aides typed faster. Reporters whispered harder. Senator Vasquez adjusted her mic but didn't speak. Her eyes, however, followed Hayes like a hawk trailing a tectonic shift. Subcommittee Chair Merrill tapped the folder in front of him. "Let the record reflect the witnesses' statements will be cross-examined post-Ekman review." Hayes's smile was humorless, razor-thin. "You're not under attack. You're under obligation. There's a difference." As the committee members gathered their notes with the precision of men who hoped the ritual of movement might dilute the sting of impact, Hayes stepped back from the podium. But he wasn't done. "Recess all you want. You'll return to the same truth. This isn't the story of a powerful man saving a powerless child. It's the story of a system that made itself deaf until it was forced to listen in court." He turned to leave, and the room, for once, knew better than to interrupt a silence earned by truth. Naomi was waiting outside the hearing room, seated on a wooden bench with her knees tucked slightly inward, her pen still. When her father approached, she didn't speak. She handed him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. 4 words in her neat, sharp cursive. "Still not the end." Hayes nodded once, the way generals nod before the battle resumes. Not out of pride, but preparation. He handed her a copy of the hearing transcript. "You write the part they'll cut." Naomi didn't blink. "I already started." That night, under a single desk lamp, Naomi flipped open the newest page of her notebook and wrote down the names no one had mentioned. Not headlines, not hashtags, just initials, dates, silence. But between each line, a clarity formed. History wasn't made in chambers. It was made when people stopped accepting silence as the status quo, and she had no intention of going quiet. The room was colder than it needed to be, not because of the air conditioning, but because of what was about to happen inside it. Captain Vernon Dale sat at the head of the table in Internal Affairs Conference Room C, not because he was in charge, but because he was now the accused. He wore the uniform still, as if fabric could insulate power, his badge clipped to the chest like a dying echo of authority. Around him, eyes didn't blink. They watched like they had been waiting years to see the ceiling fall in. A single red folder was pushed across the table. No introductions, no pleasantries, just the slow scrape of paper against plastic as the head investigator, Special Auditor Claire Monahan, said, "Let the record reflect that Captain Dale has been summoned regarding conduct unbecoming of supervisory law enforcement." Dale barely flinched. He leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk twisting under his graying mustache. "You people got nothing. I've done more for this department than anyone sitting on your side of the table." Monahan didn't blink. She opened the folder and played the first audio file. Static. Then Kellerman's voice, sharp and impatient. "I don't need a damn memo. I need this kid out of the seat now." Then Dale, slower, gruffer, deliberate. "Muzzle it early. These little ones get ideas if you let 'em talk too long. Quiet 'em down from the start." The room held its breath. Dale's smirk cracked. Monahan looked up. "Do you recognize your voice, Captain?" He hesitated for 1 second too long. "You're twisting what I said." She didn't respond. She played the second clip. Same voices. Different day. "Look," Dale said, tone annoyed, "if a 12-year-old starts lecturing law, just pull the parent card or pull the kid. Doesn't matter. We decide what they see, not them." Silence followed. Not the respectful kind. This was the silence of legal burial. Dale shifted. That was out of context. I've handled over 1,000 cases. You don't get nuance on a damn tape. Monahan placed the folder flat. Then let's talk context. 13 misconduct reports involving your subordinates, all closed in less than 3 days. 4 use-of-force complaints, where you wrote the resolution without review. 2 juvenile detainees with no legal guardian notified, and a dozen notes in your handwriting. Summaries like handled or resolved without signature from oversight. Dale slammed his palm on the table. I've kept this damn place running while the world burned around us. You think that's easy? You think you get through a decade of this without learning how to shut the noise down early? Shut the noise, Monahan repeated, almost to herself. Then, louder, like sharpening steel with syllables. You don't shut down noise, Captain. You shut down rights. You didn't keep the peace. You suppressed evidence, shielded rogue agents, and treated children like distractions to be silenced. Dale stood now, pushing the chair back with a scrape. I've given this department 12 clean years. Monahan didn't move. No, Captain, you gave it 12 quiet years. Quiet doesn't mean clean. It just means the rot didn't speak until now. 2 marshals entered from the far side of the room. Dale saw them and scoffed. You want my badge? That's it? He unclipped it slowly, mockingly, and threw it on the table. There, enjoy the souvenir. But you remember, I'm the reason half the fires in this city never made the news. Monahan picked up the badge gently, looked at it as if it were a rusted relic from another century, and handed it to the marshal. Yes, and that silence, that's exactly what we're burning down now. Then came the weapon, Dale's service pistol. The marshal held out a padded lockbox. For a moment, Dale stared at it as though the pistol might declare its loyalty and leap back into his hand. But no weapon saves a man who confuses fear for discipline. He placed it inside without ceremony, then raised his voice just one more time. You people have no idea what's coming when you unchain this chaos. Monahan at last allowed a smile. Cold, clinical, precise. We're not unchaining chaos, Captain. We're unsealing justice. The room emptied slowly. Dale was escorted out the rear hallway, not through the public lobby. Not because they spared him the humiliation, but because even disgrace has protocols. Down the hall, a janitor paused, recognizing the man in the middle of the flanked walk. Their eyes met for less than a second. The janitor looked away first. That evening, Hayes read the preliminary report alone. No press, no quotes, just the raw facts. Kellerman had fallen because of her hand. Dale fell because of his shadow. The systems that protected them had cracks deeper than any one officer could cause, but someone had poured concrete over them for years. Naomi's notebook sat beside the report. Open to a page she'd titled simply, What Quiet Costs. Hayes underlined one line she had written. Some uniforms aren't worn to serve, just to silence. He closed the notebook gently, like something sacred, then picked up the pen beside it. Not to sign a release, not to authorize a statement, just to write a single date in the corner. The day a captain learned that power without conscience isn't law, it's control, and control is always temporary. The envelope was thick, embossed, and reeked of civility, the kind that comes wrapped in velvet gloves before it slides a blade. Hayes turned it over twice before opening it. He already knew what it would contain. The letterhead was from a prestigious law firm whose clients never waited in line and whose apologies were always printed in 12-point font with disclaimers. A formal settlement offer. $8.2 million, itemized, structured, sanitized. He laid the document on the kitchen table, its weight more psychological than physical. Naomi stood a few feet away, arms folded, not in fear but in calculation. She was 12, but the air around her had aged by decades since that courtroom. Hayes read the summary aloud. Compensatory damages, psychological hardship, breach of procedural protection for minor witnesses, civil liability. His voice faded before he reached the final clause. He didn't need to read it. Naomi already understood. They're trying to pay me quiet, she said flatly. Not a question, not a surprise, just certainty distilled. We're trying to close the file, Hayes replied. She stepped forward, picked up the letter, and stared at the signatures. 3 of them, no ink smudges, no fingerprints, just names. Powerful ones. Willing to trade dollars for dignity. "If I take this," Naomi said, voice level, "then what do the others get? The ones whose dads aren't attorneys general, the ones who don't have notebooks, who doesn't get followed by cameras." Hayes didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because there was only one answer, and it weighed too much to say out loud. Naomi's eyes didn't mist. She wasn't angry. She was surgical. They get silence. She set the letter down and pulled a pen from her back pocket, the same one she used in the courtroom. The same one that had written truths when microphones weren't turned on. She wrote slowly, deliberately, on a separate sheet. Hayes watched every word form as though it were being carved in steel. "To whom it may concern," it began. "My name is Naomi Hayes. I was the subject of your offer. This letter is my formal refusal." Hayes leaned forward, breath shallow. Naomi kept writing. "I am not a product. My story is not for sale. I will not exchange my voice for financial anesthesia. If justice is something you believe can be purchased, then you have not understood the crime." Hayes stood behind her now, silent, present. Naomi continued, "You cannot settle the unsettled. You cannot price the erosion of public trust. And no one, not you, not the courts, not the systems built to fail us, has the authority to define what my dignity is worth." She signed it, carefully, clearly, then added a single line at the bottom, underlined twice. "No one gets to price what they tried to erase." She handed the letter to her father, and for a moment the kitchen, the same one where they once made waffles and avoided politics, became a courtroom of a different kind. Hayes folded the paper and slid it into a fresh envelope. "I'll deliver it myself," he said. The rejection of the $8 million offer had barely echoed through the legal corridors when the real tremor began. It wasn't in the boardrooms or press conferences where such decisions were typically dissected. It started instead in inboxes and legislative subchannels, places where silence had long held domain. Within 48 hours of the Hayes family's response, the first wave of review requests hit the federal docket, not just from activists or family lawyers. This time, it was the institutions themselves. Civil rights organizations, watchdog groups, education boards, and even pediatric psychology councils issued statements demanding comprehensive audits of law enforcement's interactions with minors in public agencies. Within days, 32 states initiated formal reopening of previously sealed or dismissed complaints involving coercive practices against minors, particularly children of color. The phrase systemic failure no longer appeared in quote marks. It was now the state language. The tipping point came when a leaked document from the Department of Justice surfaced. A routine internal call was recorded, not meant for the public, but sharp as broken glass when aired. A junior counsel, voice clipped with panic, said, "If Naomi hadn't written it down, we would have filed it under procedural deviation, just another kid who sat in the wrong chair." Statistical reports began flooding media cycles, now republished and reframed in the light of Naomi's ordeal. The most damning figure was simple: 71%. That was the percentage of coercive interventions involving children of color that had occurred without any independent legal supervision in the last decade. That number wasn't just high. It was seismic. Entire agencies began freezing current procedures. Crisis response units were redirected not to protests or civil unrest, but to compliance reviews. Overnight, documents marked archived were reclassified as evidence. Despite this national reckoning, the center of gravity remained unshaken: Naomi Hayes. She never gave a second interview, never posted online, but her handwriting, digitized, quoted, analyzed, became the North Star of a movement. A line from one of her entries was displayed outside the U.S. Capitol by a group of protesters in Navy suits. "Justice doesn't wait until you're grown up to protect you." Hayes himself was summoned twice during the first weeks of this title shift, not as a prosecutor, but as a father. He answered minimally. When asked how he felt about his daughter becoming the catalyst for policy change, he said, "She didn't cause change. She exposed what we pretended wasn't there." Meanwhile, in school districts across the country, internal memos instructed staff to audit security protocols, remove unlawful restraints from guidelines, and institute new training for dealing with vulnerable minors. The name Naomi Hayes began appearing in footnotes of educational policy drafts and civil procedure templates. Televised hearings included testimonies from other children who had endured similar experiences. Some were teenagers now, trembling as they read statements aloud. Others were younger, clutching prepared scripts. The haunting echo, "I thought I was alone." Naomi's silence had become a mirror, forcing others to speak. Even the financial world responded. 2 major insurance providers for municipal law enforcement agencies announced policy hikes for departments failing to comply with revised procedural norms. Risk had a new metric: ignorance. Yet through all of this, the image that persisted wasn't a courtroom or a hearing. It was still that third-row bench, and the girl sitting too upright, legs dangling, eyes level. It was the stillness of her. The page was on her lap. The sentence that never needed an exclamation point to pierce the noise: "Law doesn't whisper." By the close of the second week, a national task force was formed, an unprecedented coalition between federal oversight, civil liberties organizations, juvenile advocacy groups, and legal ethicists. Their first directive: define what constitutes coercion against a minor in every state statute. Their second: remove immunity from enforcement officers acting beyond protocol. At the launch briefing, one of the commissioners, a former judge, read aloud from Naomi's journal. His voice didn't shake, but the pause after each sentence did more than any speech. The press room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. Silence, once a tool of oppression, was now an emblem of reckoning. It wasn't a campaign, it wasn't a reform wave, it was structural erosion, triggered by the weight of unspoken truths. And still, at the nucleus, Naomi didn't move. Her life hadn't shifted to accommodate her fame. She went to school, she ate dinner, she wrote, and every page she turned became a ledger, not of trauma, but of consequence. Because when a child sits in a chair marked for someone else and is told to move and instead chooses to write, that isn't defiance, that's architecture. And what Naomi built from silence, the nation could no longer tear down. Her father, when cornered by a documentary team outside the courthouse, gave no interview. He simply said, "When systems break, they make noise. When they finally listen, that's when you should be afraid." That week, a billboard went up along the freeway to Capitol Hill. Just 4 words, in black on white, without logo or name. Words pulled from the margin of a 12-year-old's notebook. History remembers who watched, and no one could look away anymore. The ripple was now a wave. The quiet testimony of a 12-year-old girl had ripped through the procedural skin of a nation's legal system and left it raw. But no reform would have meaning if those who had sculpted silence into a weapon were not held up to the light. So Kellerman stood, not at her usual place of command, but as the accused in a federal courtroom that pulsed with a breathless stillness. The seal of the United States loomed over her, not as a shield, but as judgment. Her uniform was gone. Her posture was unchanged. Her chin tilted with defiance, arms stiff, eyes unswerving as if daring history to flinch first. She did not blink when the judge addressed her. She did not tremble when the prosecutor read the charges, and she did not falter until the screen lit up. The video played in full that now infamous 38 seconds. The courtroom watched as Kellerman's fingers clenched Naomi's small shoulder, watched her lips curl with disdain, watched her bark law as if it were hers to shape. The moment Naomi's voice echoed, small but crystalline, "I'm just waiting for my father," the silence in the courtroom became louder than any gavel. Kellerman's mask cracked. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't planned. One tear traced the corner of her eye and fell. Her expression did not soften. She didn't sob, but the weight of truth compressed even her spine. The judge said nothing. The prosecution didn't gloat. It was the tape that delivered the most devastating testimony. Then came the witness, A young officer, nervous in his pressed shirt, took the stand. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice too steady for comfort. "She told me, there are only two kinds of kids, silent ones and the ones we make silent." I didn't know what to say then. I thought it was a joke, but she never smiled. The courtroom didn't gasp. They simply froze. A line of ink in a courtroom transcript, but a tattoo on the nation's conscience. The prosecutor asked if Kellerman ever demonstrated excessive force. He nodded. "Once, when a boy refused to move, she told me, 'We don't raise voices here. We raise warnings, loud ones.'" Kellerman didn't interject. Her attorneys did not object. It was as if resistance had been programmed out of her. She was not a woman defending her innocence. She was a monument being dismantled. Slowly, carefully, and brick by brick, the foundation of her authority dissolved under the weight of documented cruelty. When asked if she had any words for the court, she stood. She looked at the judge. She looked at the jury. And then she looked at Naomi, seated far in the back, her hands folded in her lap, eyes clear. Kellerman's lips parted, but the courtroom waited for a speech that never came. Instead, she whispered, "I didn't think it would matter. One kid." The judge responded not with scorn, but precision, and it mattered because it was one, and because that one remembered. No drama, no yelling. The law didn't need volume. It had evidence. It had an impact. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of excessive force, guilty of misconduct, guilty of perjury in internal reporting. Kellerman's face didn't change as the sentence was read, but her posture sagged, as though every syllable weighed more than her badge ever had. The bailiff approached. Her wrists were cuffed, not harshly, not with revenge, just protocol, cold, clinical, final. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't avert her eyes, because when justice walks, it does not tiptoe. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters clamored. But inside, a nation watched its reflection and flinched. Not because it saw a monster, but because it saw someone it had once empowered. Kellerman wasn't an aberration. She was a symptom. And, as her footsteps echoed down the corridor, metronomic, slow, defeated, they weren't just the steps of a disgraced officer. They were the retreat of a broken era. She had built her world on quiet compliance. Naomi had shattered it with remembered truth. And when the courtroom emptied, only one pair of footsteps lingered, deliberate and small. Naomi walked past the now vacant defense table. She glanced down, but said nothing. Words had already done enough. Justice wasn't blind. It had just been ignored. Not anymore. The courtroom had emptied, but the echo of justice still clung to its walls. Cameras had moved on, analysts dissected verdicts, and op-eds debated what the ruling meant for policing, for law, for race, for America. But while the world searched for closure, Naomi Hayes offered none. She had never spoken for sympathy. She had spoken to remember. So, when a national morning show invited her to speak, live, unscripted, unguarded, the world leaned in, expecting grace, hoping for forgiveness. What they received instead was something heavier. She sat in a straight-backed chair, alone on the stage, no father in sight, no lawyer at her side, just her, a bottle of water untouched, and a quiet that felt deliberate. The host smiled carefully and asked the first question. "Naomi, now that Kellerman has been sentenced, do you think you can forgive her?" She didn't blink. Her voice did not tremble. She leaned slightly toward the camera, as if speaking past it. Forgiveness is not a gift you wrap in public expectations. Forgiveness is earned in silence, in change, in time. She still believes she was right. You can't forgive someone who would do it again if they thought they could get away with it. The host, caught off guard, paused. The control room went still. Naomi didn't fill the space with an apology. She owned it. The host tried again. "Would you like to send a message to Officer Kellerman? Something personal?" Naomi shook her head once. Then, after a beat, she replied, "I don't send messages to those still building cages. I speak to the kids like me, the ones who sat in the wrong chair and were told to move. Don't move. Don't shout, just write it down. Every time someone makes you small, every time silence is used like a weapon, Write it. The world forgets unless you force it to remember. Then she reached into her backpack. From it, she pulled out a brand new notebook. Plain white cover, no stickers, no name. She placed it carefully on the table in front of her, picked up a pen, and wrote the first line out loud. Not the last time. The camera cut to black. That clip spread faster than verdicts, faster than protest footage, faster than expert commentary. Because it wasn't a demand, it was a declaration. Naomi had no interest in redemption arcs for villains who hadn't changed. She had an interest in memory, in the meticulous, unforgiving, necessary act of recording. The talk show scrambled to package the segment as inspiring, but Naomi's gaze lingered long after the lights faded, because what she said wasn't marketable. It was unyielding. She didn't become a symbol of hope. She became a reminder, a voice that refused to sweeten its tone for the sake of comfort. Back at school, the notebook sat in her locker, untouched for a day, then opened. She wrote not only about Kellerman, but about the teacher who tightened her tone when Naomi asked too many questions, about the bus driver who raised his voice only when the dark-skinned kids got loud, about the lunch monitor who watched her table more than others, each entry a wound with a date and time. She wasn't collecting pain, she was keeping a record, because silence, as she had learned, was a currency of the powerful, and she refused to invest in it. Elsewhere, others followed. Hashtags emerged. Not the last time trended for 4 days. Children across districts submitted anonymous letters to school boards. Some wrote one sentence, some wrote essays, some simply wrote names. In response, 3 school superintendents across the country issued statements pledging open-door policies and anonymous complaint hotlines. It wasn't a revolution, it was accountability, the kind that doesn't cheer but watches. A columnist tried to pen a piece titled "The Grace of a Young Girl." Naomi's father requested the title be changed. She wasn't graceful, she was precise. Grace is for the guilty to sleep better. She didn't offer that. By week's end, Naomi had refused 5 more interview requests. She returned each unopened, except for one letter she addressed directly to a journalist who had once called her soft-spoken but powerful. Stop writing about how quiet I am. Start writing about what I said. The message was clear. Her story wasn't about emotion. It was about structure. Who builds it? Who breaks it? Who pays the price? In the stillness of her home, Naomi placed the new notebook beside her old one. 2 volumes. One of those happened. One for what will. Neither for comfort. Both for accountability. Because when you refuse to forgive those who aren't sorry, you don't create bitterness, you create history. The pen didn't shake, the cameras clicked, and the flashbulbs fired with machine precision. The President of the United States signed his name with the practiced gravity reserved for days history would cite by name. Behind him stood congressional leaders, civil rights advocates, and cabinet officials. Faces fixed in solemn celebration. In front of him, across a table lined with velvet and gold trim, stood Naomi Hayes. She wasn't smiling. The act that bore her name, the Naomi Hayes Act, had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan speed rare for its kind. The language was sharp, stripped of loopholes. It guaranteed legal guardianship and protection for any minor called to testify in any courtroom setting. It prohibited physical intervention by law enforcement without prior judicial oversight, and it mandated the recorded presence of an independent child advocate in every proceeding involving a minor. This law was not the result of years of slow lobbying. It was forged in 38 seconds of footage and 12 years of clarity. It didn't crawl through the committee, it crashed. The president stood and turned. A staffer handed him the ceremonial pen. Naomi approached. She accepted the gesture with neither joy nor resistance. They shook hands. Cameras immortalized the image. But Naomi's gaze wasn't on the man who signed the law. It was fixed, past him, on the monitor playing muted footage behind the stage. On it, the image of a uniformed officer gripping the arm of a seated girl, her, and she didn't flinch. Not then, not now. A journalist whispered to another, "Why isn't she smiling?" The answer was too large to fit into sound bites, because Naomi understood the cost. Because a law passed today didn't erase the silence that had lingered too long. Because She hadn't come to ceremony. She had come to bear witness again. When asked if she wanted to speak, Naomi stepped forward. She looked at the rows of lawmakers seated below the dais, the flags, the marble, the press gallery craning for her words. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't scan notes. She simply said, "This shouldn't have taken a name. It shouldn't have taken a case. It shouldn't have taken me. Laws should protect first, not respond. I'm glad this law exists, but I wish it didn't have to be mine." A hush fell. One senator clasped her hands. A young intern in the back pocketed his phone, unsure whether to film what felt too sacred for spectacle. Naomi continued, "I don't want other kids to be safe because something went wrong. I want them to be safe because everything was designed right." Then she paused, looked once more at the footage, still looping in the background. Kellerman's grip, her voice, her disdain. "I hope this law does more than carry my name. I hope it carries my memory, not being hurt, but of being believed." With that, she stepped down. No applause, no music. The silence was the tribute. The pen she had received she placed in her notebook, next to the line, "Not the last time." Outside the Capitol, reporters tried to turn the moment into a legacy, but Naomi's refusal to make peace with a broken system was itself the legacy. She hadn't forgiven. She hadn't forgotten. She had written it down, watched it change the country, and still didn't smile. That night, news anchors praised her strength. Editorials called her poised, mature, and remarkable, but none of them knew what she wrote on the page that followed. End of footnote. They passed the law, but laws don't hold hands. Kids still sit alone. The Naomi Hayes Act was real. It would be cited in training manuals, classroom modules, and courtrooms. But its truest version wasn't in its clauses. It was in the look on Naomi's face as she turned from the signing table, not toward celebration, but toward vigilance. She had not ended anything. She had simply named the storm, and left the rest of the country no choice but to look up and read it. The law bore her name, but the ripple moved faster than legislation. It reached school hallways before courtrooms, slid into lesson plans before policy memos, and lodged itself inside the consciences of teachers, students, and principals alike. Naomi's voice, once barely heard beyond the creak of courtroom benches, now resonated through ninth-grade civic textbooks, not in boldface, not as a sidebar, as core content. The essay titled "I Sat in the Right Seat" became mandatory reading. Its language wasn't elevated, it didn't try to impress. It said what needed saying. The opening line read, "I didn't defy authority, I revealed it." Students underlined it. Teachers paused there. Some choked on the next sentence. Some skipped forward, but none ignored it. In a public high school in Michigan, a student raised his hand during class. "Why do we read about wars and presidents and then suddenly this? A girl who sat down?" The teacher didn't answer. Another student did, because this time the country stood up after a high school in New Jersey named its new ethics program the Naomi Hayes Honor Initiative. It didn't offer awards. It required documentation. Students were asked to keep weekly journals of observed injustices. Some wrote about bullying. Others overheard slurs. Some pages remained blank. But the program wasn't about writing perfectly. It was about refusing to pretend not to see. In an interview, a former classmate of Naomi's recalled, "She didn't talk much. She didn't preach. But if she looked at you while something wrong was happening, you couldn't unfeel it." That quiet gravity, the kind that compels reflection without demand, became the cornerstone of a new kind of leadership curriculum. Universities studied it, workshops dissected it, but Naomi never lectured. She just kept writing, each line laid down with the same pressure as before, deliberate, unsparing, undeniable. Elsewhere, the Justice Department unveiled a new exhibit at the National Judicial Library in D.C. Visitors lined up expecting marble quotes and patriotic lighting, but in a glass case at the exhibit's center sat a reproduction of Naomi's notebook. Page open, handwriting small, clean, unflinching. On the page, "Law doesn't whisper, it remembers." Beside it, under lower lighting, rested a facsimile of the U.S. Constitution. The juxtaposition wasn't explained. It didn't need to be. One was a founding promise. The other was its reminder. Tourists stood longer at Naomi's display than at any other. Teachers brought students in small, reverent groups. A girl from Alabama cried quietly and whispered to her teacher, "She's like us, just more certain." The media tried to call it the Naomi Wave, but she never rode waves. She charted undercurrents. Politicians tried to own it. They couldn't. Civil rights groups tried to sculpt it. She stayed unmoved. She declined every offer to speak at commencements. She refused branded campaigns. She didn't become an icon. She remained an author, one who wrote while others shouted. At home, Naomi's father kept the original notebook in a locked case, not because it was precious, but because it was weighty. Some things, he told a museum curator, aren't meant for daily display. They're meant to remind you you're not done yet. Even the president, in a later address, quoted her without naming her. In this country, we must ensure that when a child speaks, the law doesn't answer with silence. But the name lived on, not in headlines, but in practices, in teacher training packets, in revised school conduct codes, in the corners of history textbooks that dared to footnote the present. And still, Naomi wrote, still she refused to edit the truth for comfort. Still she understood that one name on one law was not the peak, but a pressure point. When asked, years later, if she thought her story had changed the country, she answered, "No story changes a country. A country decides what stories it can no longer ignore." And then she wrote that, too. The pen did not pause. Wasn't scheduled on any public calendar. No press, no entourage, just a slot at 6:47 a.m., before shift change, before the day had a chance to arm itself with noise. Naomi arrived first. The guards didn't recognize her immediately. She wasn't there as a symbol or a witness or a daughter. She came as the one who had been sat down, spoken over, and still wrote back. The room was bare. Plexiglass divided two chairs and a narrow metal table in between. No microphone, no speaker, just a grease board and markers. The guard outside called it the silent booth. Naomi called it exact. Kellerman entered moments later. She wore orange, not the kind that blazed, the kind that dulled. Her hair was pulled back, but no longer severe. Her posture, still upright, carried stiffness not of pride, but of habit. She sat. Her breath fogged the glass once, then cleared. No one spoke. No one could. That was the condition. Kellerman picked up the marker first, hand slightly trembling. She wrote in caps, like trying to make the words louder than the silence. "I'm sorry." Naomi stared at it for 11 seconds. She didn't blink. Then slowly she reached for the second marker and wrote below, "I don't need your sorry. I need you to remember every word you said." Kellerman's hand dropped. She didn't wipe the board. Her eyes, once tactical, scanned Naomi's face like it might still hold room for mercy. It didn't. A soft, Naomi didn't smile, didn't sneer. Her face was not cruel, only precise. She reached into her coat pocket and laid a fresh white notebook on the table's metal surface. No label, no creases, one line written at the top of the first page. "This is not the last." Then she stood. Kellerman raised her hand against the glass, palm flattened. Naomi didn't mirror it. She turned and walked out, the notebook behind her. The door shut with a finality that wasn't dramatic, just surgical. Outside, the guard asked, "All done?" Naomi didn't answer. She kept walking, but the notebook in her hand was not the one she had left. She carried another, and it was already open to a new page. Kellerman, alone in the booth, didn't cry. That would have implied release. Instead, her shoulders collapsed, as if a sentence too heavy for legal ink had been passed through silence. She picked up the board, looked at the words again. She didn't write back. The footage, seen only by internal monitors, showed the stillness of that room longer than regulations allowed. The officer watching the screen didn't fast forward. He didn't need to. The story had moved forward without noise. In a cell later that day, Kellerman sat with both hands cupping her face. Not from grief, from the echo. Words, spoken long ago with careless authority, came back with sharp outlines. "There are two kinds of kids," she had once said to a rookie, "the silent ones and the ones we silence. Now there was a third kind, the ones who remember, and make sure you do too." Naomi walked through the cold corridor, steps echoing in perfect rhythm. She didn't turn back, didn't glance at the clock. This wasn't closure, this was documentation, the final line of a chapter only she had the right to end. And outside, the sky was pale with morning, not bright, but clear. Naomi didn't walk back into school like a symbol. There was no announcement over the intercom, no banners in the hallway, no handshake from the principal waiting at the gate. She returned the way students are supposed to, with a backpack, a pencil, and something unspoken beneath the skin that no one else could name. It was the first Monday of the month. The bell rang the same as always, shrill, functional, indifferent. Kids filed in with sneakers squeaking and lockers clanging shut like a symphony of forgetfulness. The hallway lights flickered the way they always had, half working, humming like some tired machine that no longer cared who passed beneath. The halls no longer whispered her name. They held it like breath held underwater. Just a few weeks ago, this same floor had been walked by two FBI agents escorting an officer with her badge turned inward, her uniform heavy not with authority, but exposure. Kellerman's old car, once parked with unconscious confidence in the faculty lot, now sat vandalized behind the impound fence, spray-painted with the words, "Silent isn't innocent." The janitor, thinking no one watched, snapped a photo of it and posted it online with the caption, "Poetic justice doesn't ask for approval." It circled the internet in 36 hours. Shared in every group that once ignored complaints. Then came the podcast, a former student who recalled a hallway confrontation from years back, where Kellerman had once pinned a ninth grader against a wall and murmured through clenched teeth, "There's your right to remain silent." His voice cracked during the recording, and millions downloaded it overnight. Naomi never commented. She had stopped commenting the day she realized silence, when intentional, carved deeper than outrage. A week after that podcast aired, a local coffee shop named a drink "The Whisper That Echoed," complete with a sharp black espresso shot and a white sugar cube that refused to dissolve. When a staff member asked what the drink meant, the owner shrugged, then simply pointed at a printed quote taped beside the register. "Law doesn't whisper." That same day, a local mural of police officers in uniform, once painted on the side of the precinct building, was quietly whitewashed. No press release, no artist protest, just an early morning coat of gray rolled evenly across all faces, erasing the mural's centerpiece, Kellerman's hand resting on a child's shoulder. Someone replaced it with a rough stencil, barely visible at first glance. It read, "Erase the myth, not the memory." When Naomi entered room 204, no one turned their heads. They didn't need to. The gravity in the room shifted, not in awe, but in alignment, as if a compass had been shaken, realigned. She walked to her seat without looking left or right, slid her bag down beside her chair, and exhaled like someone returning to their skin after shedding borrowed armor. Outside the window, two sparrows landed on the ledge, one flitting nervously before flying off, the other staying behind, still watching. Naomi took out her notebook, its pages empty but vibrating with intent. A classmate behind her whispered her name, not loudly, not with expectation, just enough to tether the moment. She didn't turn. Her fingers hovered over the pen cap, and she clicked it once. The teacher, who had once made her read her essays twice in front of the class, now offered no spotlight. He simply nodded and began the lesson, the way one does when history is no longer a subject, but a presence. Naomi's eyes wandered briefly to the door, half expecting it to swing open with something dramatic. But there was no drama, just dust particles dancing in the morning light, and the quiet certainty that some seats no longer had to be defended, they just had to be kept. In the office down the hall, the new security chief reviewed footage of hallways, daily logs, and lunch monitor rotations. They had quietly replaced 3 staff members in the last 2 weeks, those who had once laughed when Naomi asked where visitors were allowed to sit. One of them had filed a complaint arguing discrimination. The board dismissed it with a single sentence: complicity is not protected conduct. At lunch, Naomi sat alone by choice. She opened a yogurt, peeled the lid slowly, and read the small printed joke inside it. She didn't laugh, but her lips twitched the way people do when they understand the world hasn't fully healed but has stopped pretending it wasn't sick. Across the courtyard, a new sign had been posted over the entrance to the auditorium. Silence is not order. No one knew who had put it up, but no one took it down. That afternoon, a local news crew tried to enter the school. They were politely turned away. The guard at the front desk had a small badge on his chest, not official but handmade. It said, "No clicks without consent." Naomi, back at her desk, didn't notice. She was copying down the board notes, pausing occasionally to underline something, not because it was important, but because it might be. Later, just before the bell, the teacher handed out graded assignments. Naomi had no grade, just a comment written faintly in pencil: "You rewrote the curriculum." "I'm still catching up." She folded the paper in half and placed it between the pages of her notebook, not for safekeeping, but as a placeholder. As students gathered their things, someone knocked lightly on the door. A substitute teacher kneading the class roster. The door closed behind him with a click that sounded final, but it wasn't. Naomi stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and took one last glance at the desk where it had all started. On it, unclaimed by any teacher or student, was a single sheet of paper, placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. No header, no signature, just a single sentence, handwritten in clean black ink. "You taught a whole country how to sit in the right seat." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't need to. She placed her backpack beside the chair, pulled out a blue pen, opened the fresh notebook she now always carried, and beneath that sentence she wrote, "No one is born in the right seat. You fight to hold it." No one noticed her writing it, but someone always would. The lesson that day was on civil structure. The teacher, a soft-voiced man with elbows that always seemed too sharp for his jacket, paused before beginning. His eyes swept the room and landed on Naomi, but not in a way that demanded anything, more like a moment of mutual understanding. "We are both still learning how to teach justice without making it sound like history." Outside, a breeze tapped the window pane once and left. A news van waited a block away, but never got closer. Naomi had said no interviews, no editorials, no retrospective features. She hadn't done this to become a headline, and even if she had, it would never be the right headline. In her old seat, Naomi felt her sneakers not quite touching the floor, just like that morning so long ago. But now, the imbalance didn't feel like a flaw. It felt like a warning to everyone who still didn't get it. Chairs are built for assumptions. You have to sit in them anyway. After class, a girl she didn't know asked to borrow a pencil. Naomi handed it over without looking up. That pencil, though, had haze etched faintly near the top. Naomi had done it months ago, not for pride, for clarity. In the teacher's lounge, someone whispered that Naomi was back. Another replied she never left. But neither dared say it aloud, not out of fear, but out of reverence for a silence that had once rewritten federal law. Meanwhile, a copy of her first notebook, the one with the quote about justice bowing to meet the victim's eye, was being displayed in a national exhibit on civic memory. It sat encased in glass beside a faded copy of the Constitution. The contrast was stark, one born from consensus, the other was carved from refusal. Naomi didn't care. She wasn't there. She was at her desk, writing in her new notebook. The third line said, "History doesn't remember what it forgives. It remembers what it changes." That evening, over dinner, Luther Hayes didn't bring up the law or the court or the speech requests piling in his inbox. He passed Naomi the salad and she passed back the dressing. Between bites, she asked, "Do you think I did the right thing?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "You did something more dangerous. You didn't ask permission. She nodded once, not because she needed affirmation, but because she liked that someone saw it that clearly. Upstairs, Naomi opened her window just a crack, let the night air in. On her wall, she pinned the sentence from school. You taught a whole country how to sit in the right seat. She pinned her reply beneath it, and under that, the quote she had written before any of this began, "Law doesn't whisper." And then, in silence, she wrote another entry, just 5 words. "This seat is still mine." The page turned, and with it so did something far larger.